$3. That's all Alara Finch had the night everything changed. No home, no family, no future. Just a rusted car she slept in behind a dumpster, a dead sister's notebook she couldn't let go of, and 3 crumpled bills that were supposed to keep her alive until Friday. She wasn't supposed to be in that alley. She wasn't supposed to hear the Ducati skid across wet pavement, or see the man crumple beside it with blood running down his face, and a heartbeat she could tell was fading just by watching his chest. She was supposed to keep walking. That's what you do when you've lost everything. You stop looking. You stop caring. You stop kneeling beside strangers in freezing alleys at 2 a.m. But Alara Finch spent her last $3 on gauze and water, pressed her hands against a dying man's wound, looked into a pair of steel-gray eyes that grabbed her wrist hard enough to bruise, and said, "Nobody sent me. Shut up and stay still." She didn't know his name. She didn't know he owned half of Boston. She didn't know the secret he carried could shatter the only thing she had left, the memory of the sister she'd been grieving for 4 years. All she knew was someone was dying, and she'd already watched one person die in her arms. She wasn't going to watch another. That single act of mercy on a frozen Boston night is about to pull this woman into a world of power, violence, and loyalty, where kindness is a death sentence and trust will get you buried. And the truth waiting at the center of it all? It's the kind that doesn't just break your heart. It burns your whole life down. If this story doesn't move you, nothing will. Smash that like button, share this with someone who needs it tonight, and subscribe so you're here when the truth comes out. Now let's go back to that alley where Alara Finch made the most dangerous decision of her life with nothing but $3 and a prayer. She was still kneeling on the wet pavement when headlights tore through the alley. Not one car. 3 gleaming black SUVs came hurtling in, braking hard less than 10 steps from her, tires shrieking across the concrete like wild animals growling in the dark. The doors flew open at the same time and men stepped out, dressed in black suits, broad-shouldered, their eyes sweeping the alley the way men would scan a battlefield. Alara didn't move. Her hand was still pressed over the stranger's wound, his blood warm beneath her palm against the bone-cutting cold of Boston at 2 a.m. One man older than the others approached first, silver hair cut close, a face that looked as if it had been carved from stone and had never learned how to smile. Frankie Conti, 52 years old, consigliere to the Valente family. He knelt beside the wounded man, pressed 2 fingers to his neck to check for a pulse, then looked up at Alara for the first time. He didn't look at her the way a man looks at another human being. He looked at her as if measuring the level of danger. "Boss," Frankie called quietly, his voice rough as gravel. "The car's ready." The man beneath Alara's hand let out a faint groan. His steel-gray eyes opened slightly, stayed on her for 1 more second, then closed again. 2 bodyguards moved in and lifted him the way men would carry an injured king. Careful, precise. Not a single wasted word between them. They placed him into the middle SUV and the door slammed shut. Alara rose to her feet. Her knees were numb, both hands stained red, the cold from the pavement crawling straight up her spine. She stepped back once, then twice. The instinct of someone who'd lived on the street told her to disappear before anyone decided she was a witness who needed to be dealt with. But Frankie Conti had already turned back. He stood between her and the mouth of the alley, not blocking her path, but not giving way either. "Name," he said. Not a question. An order. Alara looked straight at him. Her eyes weren't afraid, and Frankie noticed that. A homeless girl standing in front of the consigliere of the most powerful mafia family on the East Coast without trembling. Either she was too brave, or she had nothing left to lose. "Nobody," she said. Then she turned and walked away. She didn't run. She walked. Back straight, shoulders fragile but unbowed. Frankie didn't follow. He stood there watching her disappear into the darkness at the end of the alley, her small frame growing smaller and smaller until it vanished beyond the corner, as if she had never existed at all. But Frankie Conti hadn't lived to 52 in this world by letting a witness walk away without leaving a trace. He pulled out his phone and quickly took a picture of the rusted Honda Civic parked at the far end of the alley, a car that clearly had someone living inside it because the back seat was spread with old blankets and a backpack was shoved beneath the floorboard. License plate. 1 phone call. 20 minutes later, the facial recognition software from the security camera at the convenience store at the mouth of the alley had produced a result. Frankie sat in the car, reading on his phone screen the first lines of a shattered life. Alara Finch, 27 years old, former medical student at Boston University, dropped out at 23. Mother died 2 years later. No relatives, No fixed address, no criminal record, and one detail that made Frankie frown and read it again. Younger sister, Phoebe Finch, 19 years old, died from a firearm injury in 2022. Case closed, unsolved. He switched off the screen, looked out through the car window at the Boston night slowly fading. Before dawn, this file would be lying on Nico Valente's desk, and Frankie Conti, the man who had served the Valente family for 30 years, felt for the first time that a girl with empty hands, empty pockets, and the name Nobody was about to shake the empire he had spent his entire life protecting. The next morning, Boston woke beneath a heavy blanket of gray mist, and Alara Finch woke on the back seat of her Honda Civic, with the smell of a stranger's blood still clinging to both her hands. She sat up, her body stiff with cold, her breath turning to white smoke inside the car. The first step of every day was always the same. Stuff the blanket into her backpack, check that Phoebe's notebook was still tucked inside the zippered inner pocket, then drive to the Shell station on Dorchester Avenue. The gas station restroom was her bathroom. Cold water, soap pumped from a plastic dispenser bolted to the wall. A cracked mirror reflecting the face of a woman of 27, but eyes that were far older than that. She washed her hands 3 times. The dried blood came loose in reddish-brown flakes beneath the running water. She scrubbed harder, not because of hygiene, but because she didn't want to see it anymore. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, because the last time she had washed someone's blood from her hands was 4 years earlier, on the floor of a laundromat, when Phoebe had been lying there, and nothing Alara knew had been enough to keep her sister from slipping away. She changed her shirt, the last clean t-shirt in her backpack, then pulled on her heavy coat over it. By 4 in the afternoon, she came through the back kitchen door of Serafina in Back Bay. Just like every other day. Just like a shadow no one ever noticed. Serafina was an upscale Italian restaurant with chandeliers and white tablecloths, the kind of place where customers ordered a bottle of wine that cost as much as Alara lived on for a month. She never saw the dining room. She only saw the dish sink, stacks of dirty plates taller than her head, and the backs of chefs who never remembered her name. Today she was 3 minutes late. 3 minutes. But Regina Ashworth was already standing by the kitchen door, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment all day. 44 years old, hair pinned up high, red lipstick, clothes always perfectly pressed. Regina ran Serafina on contempt and fear. 3 minutes late, Finch. Regina's voice didn't need to rise to cut. I hire dishwashers to show up on time, not whenever they feel like it. Alara lowered her head. I'm sorry. It won't happen again. That's right, it won't, because next time will be the last. Regina let her eyes travel over Alara from head to toe, the look of someone judging something beneath her. And wash that coat. You smell like the street. Alara didn't answer. She walked straight to the sink, turned on the hot water, and started scrubbing the first stack of plates. 4 hours later, when the night shift ended, and she stepped out the back door of Serafina with $70 in cash for the whole week tucked into her coat pocket, she didn't go back to the car. She walked 3 blocks to Walt's Diner, the small place on the corner of East Broadway and Southie. The diner had only 8 stools lined up along the counter, black and white photographs from the Gulf War hanging on the walls, and the smell of bacon grease always lingering in the air even after closing time. Walt Brody stood behind the counter, drying glasses, the prosthetic on his left leg striking the wooden floor with a dull clop each time he moved. 60 years old, silver beard, the insignia of the 1st Infantry Division tattooed on his left arm. He had lost his leg in Kuwait in '91 and lost his wife to cancer 10 years later. He hadn't opened the diner to make money. He had opened it because he didn't know what else to do with these hands except feed people. Alara was his last customer every night, or more truthfully, she was the only one Walt never charged. You look like a stray cat that lost a fight, Walt said when she settled onto her usual stool at the end of the counter. He set a plate with a hot chicken sandwich and a mug of black coffee in front of her without even asking. Alara wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. Walt noticed the reddish-brown stain on the cuff of her coat, the patch she hadn't managed to wash clean. He didn't say anything. He only looked. Waited. Someone was hurt last night, Alara said softly, in the alley behind Newbury. Motorcycle crash. I held the bleeding until his people got there. Walt stopped drying the glass. His people. Black SUVs. 3 of them. Men in suits. A long silence. Walt set the glass down on the counter, gently, but with finality. Did you see what kind of bike? A Ducati. Black. Looked like a Diavel. And what did his people call him? Boss. Walt closed his eyes for 1 second. When he opened them again, the look in them had changed completely. He no longer looked like the kind old man who gave her free sandwiches. He looked like a soldier who had seen enough death to know when danger was coming near. Listen to me, kid. In this city, there are people you can help and people you stay away from. The Valente family belongs in the second kind. They're not the people you help. They're the people you survive. Ilara bit into the sandwich, chewed slowly. He was just a man bleeding, Walt. No one in that world is ever just anything, Ilara. Everything has a price, and they always collect. She didn't answer. She finished the sandwich, drank every drop of the coffee, then thanked Walt with the same small nod she gave him every night. When she stepped out the door, Walt called after her. Ilara. She turned back. If anyone comes asking about last night, you don't know anything. You didn't see anything. You weren't there. She looked at him, then nodded. But both of them already knew that in the world of the Valente family, whether she knew anything or not wouldn't mean a thing if they decided they wanted to find her. At the same time, Ilara was sitting in Walt's diner eating her sandwich, a few miles away, on the 60th floor of Millennium Tower. Nico Valente sat in the darkness of his penthouse with a cup of espresso gone cold and the bright glow of a tablet screen in front of him. 3 in the morning and he still hadn't slept. The wound at his temple had been closed with 4 stitches by his private doctor. A neat strip of bandage resting beneath his black hair, but he had refused to go to the hospital even though Frankie had pleaded with him the entire ride back. A hospital meant records. Records meant evidence. Evidence meant a weapon in the hands of an enemy, and Nico Valente never handed anyone a weapon. He sat in a black leather chair beside the glass wall overlooking all of Boston. The city spread beneath him like a chessboard whose every piece he knew by heart. 36 years old. 14 years at the head of the Valente family, since his father had been shot dead in his own restaurant. Nico had taken over at 22, too young by anyone's standards except his own. He crushed 3 internal rebellions in the first 2 years, expanded control from the port of Boston to luxury real estate all along the East Coast, and turned Valente Holdings into a flawless, legitimate front that no prosecutor had ever been able to touch. People called him many things. Boss, the wolf. But no one called him by his real name except Frankie, and even Frankie only did it when they were alone. Now Nico was reading the file of a girl who, 2 hours earlier, had been kneeling in a dark alley with her hand pressed over the wound on his head, telling him to shut up. Frankie had sent the file at 2:47 in the morning. Complete. Ilara Finch, 27 years old. Born in Worcester, Massachusetts. Father left when she was 4, no record of contact. Mother, Diana Finch, supermarket cashier, died in 2024. Cause of death, liver failure from alcohol. Ilara entered the medical program at Boston University in 2019. Grade point average 3.8. Described by professors as the finest student in the class in emergency medicine. Dropped out in 2022. No reason listed in the file. Nico moved through those lines quickly, his eyes scanning the information the way he read financial reports, cold and efficient, until he reached the family section. Sister, Phoebe Finch, 19 years old, died on October 17th, 2022. Cause, firearm wound. Location, Quick Clean Laundromat, corner of Dorchester Avenue and Adams Street. Case classification, gang-related. Status, closed, unsolved. Nico's finger stopped on the screen. It didn't stop because he was reading slowly. It stopped because his body reacted before his mind could control it. His jaw tightened. The muscles along his collarbone went rigid. He read the line again. Phoebe Finch. Quick Clean Laundromat, October 17th, 2022. He shut the tablet, set it down on the table, looked out through the glass at the Boston night for a very long time, his face expressionless, but his steel-gray eyes darkening like a sky before a storm. Then he stood, crossed to the east wall of the study, and opened the oil painting of the Tuscan countryside, revealing the safe hidden behind it. Code, fingerprint, a click. Inside the safe there wasn't money or business paperwork. There was a simple silver ring with the letter T engraved on the inside band, a handwritten letter on lined paper, the rough, rushed handwriting of someone young, and a black file folder with no label, containing crime scene photographs from the laundromat shooting, an internal ballistics report, and a list of names no public agency had ever seen. Nico picked up the ring, closed his fist around it until the edge of the metal pressed into his skin. He didn't look at the letter. He didn't need to. He had known every word of it by heart for 4 years. He stood there, the ring in one hand, the other braced against the edge of the safe, and in the silent penthouse above Boston, Nico Valente didn't look like the most powerful mafia boss on the East Coast. He looked like a brother standing at his sister's grave where no one was allowed to see him. Then he shut the safe, slipped the ring into the breast pocket of his shirt, the place nearest his heart, picked up his phone and called Frankie. Find her. Frankie hesitated on the other end. Boss, she's a nobody. Pay her, she disappears. Done. I said find, not pay. Find. Bring her to me. A long silence. Then Frankie said, yes, boss. Nico ended the call. Set the phone down. His eyes settled on the security camera image of Alara's face that Frankie had attached to the file. A gaunt face, dark eyes, no fear, no pleading. The face of someone who had already hit bottom and had nowhere left to fall. Her sister had died in the laundromat shooting 4 years ago. That shooting sat neatly inside the black folder in his safe, and the ring engraved with the letter T was resting now against the left side of his chest, growing warmer with the heat of his body, as though its former owner had never truly gone at all. The following afternoon, Alara was bent over scrubbing grease from a pan in Serafina's kitchen when a wave of whispers drifted in from the dining room like surf. The head chef looked up. The prep cooks stopped what they were doing. Someone murmured a name, and the entire kitchen fell silent, as if someone had pulled the plug from the wall. Alara didn't pay attention. She had learned long ago not to pay attention to anything beyond the dish sink. But then the swinging door burst open, and Regina Ashworth stepped in, her face paler than her red lipstick, her eyes wide as if the president himself had just walked into her restaurant. Take off that apron, Finch, Regina said quickly, her voice hushed but sharp as a blade. Get out there. Someone's asking for you. Alara looked up, her hands still submerged in dirty water. I'm in the middle of my shift. Leave the shift. Out. Now. The way Regina said it made Alara understand that this wasn't a request. She wiped her hands on her apron, stepped through the swinging door into the dining room, and saw him. Nico Valente stood in the middle of Serafina as if he owned the place. And the truth was, he did. A perfectly tailored black suit in 3 pieces. A Patek Philippe on his left wrist, catching the chandelier light, the wound at his temple from the night before, now reduced to a small strip of bandage, almost hidden in his hairline. 2 bodyguards stood by the entrance. Frankie Conti stood 3 steps behind him, his arms folded across his chest. And in the middle of a crowded lunch service, not a single customer dared keep chewing. Nico saw Alara step out of the kitchen, dirty apron, wet hands, hair tied back in a hurry. She looked exactly like what the file had described. A girl with nothing left. But her eyes did not. Those eyes looked straight at him. Without lowering, without avoiding, without even the smallest flicker of fear, and Nico recognized them at once as the same eyes he had seen in the dark alley when she told him to shut up and lie still. Regina rushed to Nico before Alara could say a word, her voice sugary in a way that made the falseness obvious. Mr. Valente, what an honor. Your usual table is ready. I didn't come here to eat, Nico cut in, his eyes still on Alara. I came for your dishwasher. Regina's mouth opened, then closed. Her eyes darted from Nico to Alara and back again, trying to process the fact that the most powerful man in Boston had driven across the city to find a girl who washed dishes. Nico walked toward Alara. Frankie moved with him, but Nico lifted one hand, a small gesture, and Frankie stopped immediately. Nico came to a halt in front of her, closer than the night before, because this time they were both standing, and Alara realized that he was nearly a head taller than she was. The scent of expensive cologne mixed with the smell of leather from his coat, something entirely foreign to her world. You disappeared before I had the chance to thank you, Nico said, his voice low and slow, every word measured with care. Alara answered calmly. Your people didn't seem eager to have me stay and chat. Frankie is cautious. That's his job. Nico slipped a hand into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, drew out a thick white envelope, and placed it on the nearest table between them. Alara looked at the envelope, then at Nico. No, she said. Nico tilted his head slightly. You haven't opened it. I don't need to. I know what's inside, and the answer is still no. I owe you. You don't owe me anything. Someone was dying. I stopped the bleeding. That's all. That's not something you pay for. The dining room was utterly silent. Alara hadn't raised her voice, but in the stillness of 50 customers holding their breath, every word rang out as clearly as a bell. Nico stood there, the envelope resting on the table between them, and he didn't pick it back up. He looked at her with an expression Frankie, standing behind him, recognized immediately, because he had followed Nico for 14 years and had never seen it before. Surprise. Not surprise because he had been refused. Nico had been refused many times, with guns, with knives, with the armies of other families. Surprise because this homeless girl who washed dishes had refused his money in a tone that made it sound as though he had insulted her. "What about coffee?" Nico said after a pause. "Not as payment, just to talk." Alara almost laughed. Almost, because she had forgotten how to laugh a long time ago. "I live in my car, Mr. Valente. I don't go out on coffee dates." He looked at her for one beat longer, then gave a slight nod, as if she had just said something worthy of respect instead of turning him down. "Then I'll find another way." He didn't say it like a threat, but it wasn't an empty promise either. It was the statement of a man who had never given up on anything in his life, and Alara heard that clearly. Nico turned away. The envelope was still lying on the table. He didn't take it. Frankie opened the door. The 2 bodyguards followed. The whole group disappeared through the glass entrance, and the dining room of Serafina slowly began to breathe again, as if it had just emerged from the eye of a storm. Alara still stood there, dirty apron, wet hands, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. She turned back toward the kitchen, but Regina blocked her path. She no longer looked rattled. She was smiling now. The kind of smile Alara had learned on the street was more dangerous than any slap. "Don't flatter yourself, Finch," Regina said softly, almost in a whisper, just loud enough for the 2 of them to hear. "Men like him don't see girls like you. They use girls like you, and when they're done, girls like you disappear, sometimes forever." Alara didn't answer. She stepped past Regina, pushed through the swinging door, went back to the dish sink, turned on the hot water, and plunged her hands into the pile of dirty plates. But for the remaining 4 hours of her shift, she couldn't stop thinking about those steel gray eyes when he had said, "Then I'll find another way." Not because she was afraid, but for the first time in 2 years of living invisible, someone had looked straight at her and truly seen that she was standing there. He said he would find another way. Alara hadn't imagined another way would mean showing up at Walt's diner at 7 o'clock the next morning on a gleaming black Ducati Diavel, parked right in front of the place, as if a $200,000 bike belonged. On a Southie sidewalk, Alara was sitting on her usual stool at the end of the counter, eating the breakfast Walt had set in front of her without asking, when the glass door opened and Nico Valente walked in. No suit today. Black leather jacket, black pants, black boots. He looked less like a chief executive officer and more like himself. The strip of bandage at his temple had grown smaller, almost invisible now. He looked around the diner. 8 stools, an old wooden counter, war photographs on the wall, the smell of bacon grease in the air, and there wasn't even the slightest trace of contempt on his face. He sat down beside Alara with one empty stool between them, as if he understood that sitting any closer would be an intrusion. Walt stood behind the counter and looked Nico up and down. He recognized the Ducati outside, recognized the posture, recognized all of it, because Walt Brody had not survived war in 30 years in Southie by failing to recognize danger when it sat down at his own counter. He set a mug of black coffee in front of Nico. $2.50. No discount for suits. Nico looked at Walt, then at the coffee. Then he set a $5 bill on the counter. "Keep the change." "I don't take tips from strangers who sit in my diner at 7 in the morning without being invited," Walt said flatly, pushing the bill back and placing $2.50 in change beside the mug. Nico said nothing. He picked up the change. And for the first time, Alara saw something flicker across his face. Not a smile, but the shadow of amusement, as if he was used to living in a world where everyone said yes, and had suddenly run into 2 people in a row who said no. Alara didn't look at Nico. She looked down at her plate of eggs, but she had stopped eating the moment he walked in. "You followed me," she said. "Not a question. I found you. There's a difference. Not to me. To me there is." Silence. Walt dried a glass at the far end of the counter, his eyes never leaving the 2 of them. His ears sharpened. Alara turned and looked at Nico for the first time that morning. Under the cheap fluorescent lights of Walt's diner, he looked completely different from both times before. Not the blood-soaked man in the alley, not the boss in a suit in the middle of a fine restaurant. Someone in between, more tired than he wanted to appear. And for the first time, Alara noticed the dark circles beneath his eyes, the way he held the coffee mug with his left hand because his right hand trembled slightly, and the rhythm of his breathing that wasn't entirely steady. The medical instinct she had thought she had buried 4 years ago suddenly stirred. "You're dangerous," she said. Not an accusation. A fact, spoken plainly, the way lab results are read to a patient. Nico took a sip of coffee. "And you're wasted," he replied. Alara frowned. "Your hands?" Nico said. "The way you stopped my bleeding that night. Exact. Fast. No hesitation. You pressed exactly over the temporal artery without needing to look. That's not first aid learned on YouTube. That's clinical reflex." He looked at her. "The best medical student in her class is washing dishes in my restaurant and sleeping in a car behind dumpsters. If that's not waste, then I don't know what is." Alara tightened her hand around the coffee mug. "You read my file. I read everyone's file. Then you know why I left school. I know the event. I don't know the reason. The event and the reason usually aren't the same thing." She didn't answer. Nico set down his coffee, turned on the stool to face her, and for the first time he spoke honestly. Not in the voice of a boss, not in the voice of negotiation, but in the voice of a man placing something dangerous on the table between them. "That night I didn't crash because of the slick road. My heart stopped for 2 seconds. Hypertrophic cardiomyopathy." He said the name of the disease in a flat voice, as if he were reading the name of a street. "Thickened heart muscle. Sudden arrhythmia. It lasted long enough for me to lose control of the bike." Alara looked at him. Her medical instinct didn't just stir now. It woke all the way up. She remembered immediately. Hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, the leading cause of sudden death in young adults. A fatality risk within 3 to 5 years if left untreated, requiring continuous monitoring, beta blockers, possibly an implanted defibrillator. "You need a hospital," she said at once. "No, this isn't something you heal on your own." "I know, but a hospital means records. Records mean proof that I could die at any moment. In my world, that information isn't a medical chart, it's a death sentence." He looked directly at her. "I need a doctor. No records. No hospital. No one knows except you and me." Alara understood immediately what he was asking, and she understood her answer just as quickly. "I stopped saving people 4 years ago." Nico didn't react. He didn't persuade. He didn't push. He pulled a business card from his jacket pocket and placed it on the counter beside her coffee mug. There was only a phone number written by hand on the back. "When you change your mind," he said. Not if. When. He stood up, left exactly $2.50 for the coffee on the counter, gave Walt a brief nod, and walked out the door. The Ducati roared to life, thundered once, then faded into the morning traffic of Southie. Walt came over to Alara, looked at the card on the counter, looked at her, said nothing. He didn't need to, because they both knew Alara had not thrown the card away. She was holding it in her hand, her thumb brushing lightly over the handwritten row of numbers, and that said more than any answer could have. 4 blocks from Walt's diner, in a black sedan with tinted windows parked by the curb, a 40-year-old man with a face as sharp as a blade sat studying telephoto images on his phone. Nico Valente walking into a working-class diner. Nico Valente sitting beside a homeless girl. Nico Valente handing her a card. Gianni Mancuso scrolled through each photograph slowly and carefully, like a cat licking its lips before a bowl of milk. He lifted his phone and made the call. "The boss is visiting a homeless girl in Southie. Place is called Walt's Diner. She washes dishes at Serafina." The voice on the other end said something. Gianni nodded. "Keep watching. Every move. I want to know what she eats, where she sleeps, who she talks to." He ended the call. Looked again at the photograph of Nico and Alara sitting beside each other in that tiny diner, and the smile on Gianni Mancuso's face held no warmth at all, only calculation. Because in this world, when a boss begins to care about someone, that person doesn't become his strength. That person becomes his weakness. And Gianni Mancuso had built his entire career on finding other people's weaknesses. For 3 days, Alara kept the business card in the pocket of her coat without calling. For 3 days, she scrubbed pans at Serafina, ate dinner at Walt's, drove back to the patch of ground behind the dumpsters, curled up in her sleeping bag on the back seat of her Honda Civic, and told herself that she didn't need anyone, especially not a mafia boss with steel gray eyes and a heart that was preparing to stop. On the third night, she finished her dishwashing shift at 11 o'clock, drove back to her usual place through the empty streets of Southie, turned onto the familiar road leading to the lot behind the abandoned warehouses where she had parked for 7 months, and came to a stop. A steel mesh fence more than 6 feet high now enclosed the entire lot. A brand new sign hung on the fence, red letters on a white background, construction area, no trespassing, housing development project by Whitfield Group. All illegally parked vehicles have been removed. Removed. Such a clean, polite word to describe hauling away the only home she had while she was somewhere else, scrubbing bacon grease off cast iron pans for other people. Alara, parked by the curb, stepped out, gripped the wire fence, and stared inside. The lot was empty. The Honda Civic was gone. Her blanket, her pillow, the spare clothes she kept in the trunk, the first aid kit she had pieced together from a free clinic, all of it had vanished with the car into some scrapyard where it would sit in line waiting to be crushed into a block of twisted metal. She stood there. The Boston wind in February sliced through her thin coat, backpack on her shoulders, Phoebe's notebook in the zippered pocket inside, wallet empty, literally empty, because the $70 from Serafina that week had already gone to gas and food. 0. Not a single cent. She had been here before, not on this exact street, but inside this exact feeling, the feeling that the ground beneath her feet had disappeared and there was nothing left to hold on to. The last time had been when her mother died, when the apartment was taken back because no one could pay the rent, and Alara had stepped onto the street with one backpack and a promise to herself that she would survive each day, just one day, and figure out the next one later. She had survived 700 days that way, and now she was standing back at the beginning. She thought about driving to Walt's, but Walt's diner had closed at 9. She didn't knock on his door. Walt had already given her too much, and Alara hated owing anyone because debt meant dependence, and dependence meant one more thing to lose. Midnight, Boston Medical Center, the emergency room. She walked through the automatic doors and sat down on a plastic chair in the waiting area, between a drunk man clutching a broken arm and a young mother holding a feverish child. The emergency room was open 24/7, warm, brightly lit, and no one asked why she was sitting there. This was where Boston's homeless came when the temperature dropped below freezing. The medical staff knew. Security knew. Everybody pretended not to know. Alara sat straight-backed on the plastic chair, backpack held against her chest, eyes open. She couldn't sleep, not because of the noise or the fluorescent lights, because all around her were the sounds of monitor machines, nurses calling to one another, stretchers rattling across the floor, the smell of antiseptic, the smell of a hospital, and every bit of it drove straight into the memory of 4 years earlier, when she had run into this emergency room, this exact emergency room, with Phoebe's blood on her hands and her own voice screaming, "Save my sister," when no one had been fast enough. 5 o'clock in the morning. Alara stepped out of the hospital while it was still dark, her breath turning to smoke in the air. She pulled the business card from her coat pocket, looked at the row of handwritten numbers on the back, dialed. 1 ring, 2 rings. In the middle of the third, Nico's voice came through, fully awake even though it was only 5 in the morning, as if he never slept at all. "Valente." "I'll take the job," Alara said, "but I have conditions." A brief silence. "Where?" "Serafina, 9 o'clock, after opening." "I'll be there." She hung up, said nothing more, offered no explanation. She had learned that explanations were a luxury for people who had choices. At 9 that morning, Serafina was closed to customers, but the back kitchen door was open. Nico was already there, seated at a table by the window, black espresso in front of him, black shirt, no tie, his right hand resting on the table. Frankie stood by the entrance. Alara sat across from Nico. No greeting, no explanation for why she had changed her mind. She went straight to the point. "First, I only handle medical matters, examinations, monitoring, prescriptions, emergency care. I don't touch anything else you do. I don't see anything, hear anything, or know anything beyond your health." Nico nodded. "Agreed." "Second, you pay me. I find my own room. I don't stay at your place. I don't use your car. And I don't accept anything except wages. I'm your private physician, not your property. Agreed. Quick, without hesitation. Third. Ilara looked straight into Nico's eyes. You never lie to me. About anything. Nico didn't nod this time. He looked at her. For a long time. Frankie, standing by the door, shifted one foot slightly, recognizing that the silence from his boss was not thought but calculation. The calculation between truth and safety. I don't lie, Nico said at last. I leave things out. Ilara didn't blink. In my experience, that's the same thing. Nico looked at her for one more beat. Then he nodded, slowly. A nod that was not entirely agreement, but more an acknowledgement that she was right, and that he would still do things his own way. But that was all Ilara could demand for now. She stood up. When do I start? This afternoon. Frankie will bring you over. Ilara turned away. At the door, she stopped without looking back. On the card you left at Waltz, you wrote, when you change your mind, not if. That's right. Were you confident? Or did you already know I was going to lose my car? Silence. Then Nico, his voice low. I didn't know in advance. But I know this world always takes the last thing people have before it offers them a new choice. Ilara stepped outside. The Boston air in February was sharp enough to cut skin. But for the first time in 7 months of sleeping in a car, she knew that tonight she would have a roof over her head. The price was stepping into the orbit of the most dangerous man in this city, and she wasn't sure whether that was salvation or only a slower way to die. The first 2 weeks unfolded exactly the way Ilara had demanded. Professional. Cold. Not one unnecessary word. Every afternoon she arrived at the Millennium Tower penthouse at 3 o'clock. Frankie met her in the lobby and brought her up to the 60th floor. She went into Nico's study, examined him, took notes, wrote prescriptions, then left. She didn't stay. She didn't drink coffee. She didn't ask about anything except heart rate, blood pressure, and symptoms. She treated Nico Valente exactly like a patient, nothing more, and he let her do it without complaint. But the problem with silence is that it forces people to observe, and both of them were dangerously good at observing. On the third day, Ilara realized that Nico never sat with his back to the door. No matter what he was doing, laptop, phone, reading documents, his chair always faced the exit. When she examined him, he sat in the chair by the window instead of lying on the sofa, because lying down meant losing his line of sight, and Nico Valente didn't lose his line of sight with anyone, not even the person he was allowing to touch his wrist and count his pulse. On the 5th day, she noticed the medicine bottle on his desk. Metoprolol, a beta blocker for his heart. She picked it up and checked the dose. 50 milligrams, twice a day. Wrong. With the level of thickening in his heart muscle that she had measured through her stethoscope, the dose should have been 100 milligrams. Someone had prescribed too little, or Nico had lowered the dose himself because he hated the way the medicine slowed his reflexes. She adjusted the prescription, left a note in the medical file, and said nothing. But the next morning when she arrived, the bottle on the desk had been replaced with the 100 milligram dose. He didn't say anything either. It was the first conversation they had without opening their mouths. On the 8th day, she needed him to take off his shirt so she could check his blood pressure properly. Nico hesitated for 1 second, so brief that an ordinary person wouldn't have noticed. But Ilara had spent 4 years on the street, where 1 second of hesitation could be the distance between safety and danger, so she saw it. He turned his back and took off his shirt, and she saw the scars. Not fighting scars. Old scars, faded, long, running horizontally across his spine, the kind of marks Ilara had seen in her medical textbooks in the chapter on child abuse. The scars of a belt, of a whip, of a child who hadn't run fast enough. She didn't ask. She placed the stethoscope on his back, listened to his heart, wrote down her notes, and when he put his shirt back on, she said, "Your blood pressure's fine," in a normal voice as if she hadn't just read the history of his pain through his skin. But from that day on, the hand with which she placed the stethoscope on him became gentler. And Nico knew it. On the 10th day, Ilara found the file in his desk drawer when she was looking for a pen to write a prescription. It wasn't a business file. It was a sponsorship file for St. Mary Orphanage in Dorchester. Monthly transfers, regular, steady, for 4 straight years, with no sender's name attached. The most powerful mafia boss in Boston was quietly supporting orphaned children. She placed the file back exactly where it had been, said nothing. But that day when she checked his pulse, she left her hand resting on his wrist for 2 seconds longer than necessary, and she didn't even realize she had done it until Nico looked down at her hand and then up into her eyes without saying a word. She pulled her hand away at once, wrote 72 beats per minute in her notebook. His heartbeat was normal. Hers wasn't. On the 12th day, she saw the photograph. Nico opened his wallet to hand Frankie money for coffee, and Alara caught a glimpse of a small picture tucked into the fold. A young man with a bright smile sitting on a cream-colored Vespa, black curly hair, shining eyes, maybe 18 or 19. Someone important. Someone gone. She knew because Nico kept the photograph in his wallet instead of on his desk, which meant that person went everywhere with him. But he didn't want anyone else to see. She didn't ask yet. It wasn't time. But she remembered. Nico was reading her too. He saw that she always used her right hand when she stitched, when she wrote, when she gave injections, but caught things with her left hand, opened bottle caps with her left hand, a natural left-handed instinct disciplined by medical training into using the right because surgical instruments were designed for right-handed people. He saw that she always checked the door and the windows each time she entered a room, a quick sweep, almost unconscious, the habit of someone who had lived on the street long enough to know that she always had to know the way out before she needed it. And he saw her glance at his cup of espresso every morning, glance at the sugar cube he always placed beside the saucer but never dropped into the coffee. Once she asked, "Why do you set the sugar there if you never use it?" Nico answered without looking up from his laptop. "My mother always put sugar in my coffee for me. Since she died, I drink it black. But I still leave the sugar there." She didn't say anything more. He didn't say anything more. But the next afternoon when she arrived, beside Nico's espresso there was another cup of black coffee, placed where she usually sat to write her notes. And beside that cup was a sugar cube. She sat down, looked at the sugar cube, looked at Nico. He was reading documents and didn't look up. She drank the coffee black, didn't add the sugar, but she didn't throw the sugar cube away. She left it there beside the cup, just like he did. 2 sugar cubes that no one put into coffee lay side by side on the desk of the most powerful mafia boss in Boston. And that was how feeling began between 2 people who didn't know how to love, not through words, not through grand gestures, but through silences that neither of them slowly wanted to fill anymore. At the end of the 2nd week, Alara needed to complete Nico's full health assessment, and there was one section she had put off for long enough: family medical history. She sat in her usual chair beside his desk, notebook open, pen ready, and asked in a doctor's voice, the same way she would ask any patient. "Any family history of heart disease?" Nico was reading documents on his laptop and didn't look up. "My mother. Heart failure. Died when I was 14. He said it the way someone reads a line from a spreadsheet. No tremor, no pause, but his fingers on the keyboard stopped typing for 1 beat before moving again. "Your father?" "Shot. Died when I was 22. Alara looked up. Nico was still staring at the screen. "Occupational hazard," he added, his voice so flat it was almost sarcastic. She wrote it down in her notebook. No comment. In these past 2 weeks, she had learned that Nico gave information the way he fired bullets. Short, precise, and never more than he intended. Asking for more before he was ready was no different from punching a concrete wall. "Any siblings?" Silence. This time it wasn't the brief silence of someone thinking. It was the long silence of someone deciding which door to open, and how far. Nico closed the laptop. For the first time during the examination, he looked at her instead of the screen. A younger brother. Tommy. The name left his mouth heavier than every other word he had spoken before it. "He died 4 years ago." Alara stopped writing. Not because she was surprised, but because the way Nico said Tommy's name sounded exactly like the way she said Phoebe's, as if he had to swallow broken glass every time he pronounced it. "Illness or accident?" she asked softly. "Motorcycle crash, in Italy, 1 beat. He was reckless. Always reckless. Always trying to prove he was worthy." Then he added, his voice lower, as if he were speaking more to himself than to her. "He made a choice. Every choice has consequences." Alara wrote, "Brother, died 4 years ago, accident," into the notebook. But her hand slowed around the pen, because her mind was processing not the medical information, but what he had just said. Every choice has consequences. Most people, speaking about a dead brother, would say, he was unlucky, or life was unfair. Nico said, he made a choice, as if Tommy's death had not been an accident but the end of a chain of decisions. She didn't ask more, but she remembered. The silence stretched on. Then Nico asked, without looking at her, his eyes fixed on the Boston skyline beyond the window, "You lost your sister." It wasn't a question. He had read the file. He knew, but this was the first time he had spoken of it. And the way he said it wasn't to confirm information. It was to open a door for her, if she wanted to walk through it. Alara set the pen down, looked at the medical notebook, then looked out the window in the same direction he was looking, as if they were both searching the horizon for the same thing, and neither of them could find it. "Phoebe," she said. The first time in 4 years she had spoken her sister's name to anyone other than Walt. She loved sunflowers. She grew one in a cheap plastic pot on the windowsill of our apartment, with dirt bought from a dollar store. The sunflower leaned toward the window to catch the light, and Phoebe said that was proof that every living thing knows how to look for brightness. She stopped, breathed in. She worked at the laundromat to help me pay my medical school tuition. I told her not to do it. Said I could borrow the money. But she said, "You take care of the saving people part. I'll take care of the washing clothes part. Fair deal." She used to write little notes in the margins of my medical books. Random things. "You're going to be the best doctor in the world. Remember to eat lunch. This chapter is so boring, sis." She smiled, and for the first time Nico saw her smile. That smile hurt more than any tears would have. She died at 19, and I stopped believing and looking for light. Nico listened. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." He didn't say, "I understand." He didn't say any of the empty things people say when faced with someone else's pain because they don't know what else to offer. Instead, he stayed silent long enough for Alara to know that he was truly listening, not just waiting for his turn to speak. Then he said, his voice low and slow, "Courage and intelligence aren't enough in this world. Timing is what decides, and timing is the cruelest thing of all." Alara looked at him. That sentence wasn't comfort. It was truth. The truth of someone who had lost someone and knew that there is no reason good enough, no lesson large enough, only the wrong moment and consequences that never leave. She gave a small nod. He gave a small nod. And for the first time in that penthouse, the distance between them shrank, not because either of them moved closer, but because both of them realized they were standing on the same ruined piece of ground. She gathered her tools and prepared to leave. Nico opened the laptop again. Alara turned back to the desk to pick up the pen she had forgotten, and for one brief second her eyes skimmed across Nico's laptop screen before he could change tabs. A spreadsheet. A bold title at the top. Compensation Fund. Incident 2022. Nico closed the laptop. Quickly. Not abruptly, because Nico never did anything abruptly, but faster than usual. He looked at her. She looked at him. "I'll send next week's prescription through Frankie," she said in an even voice, then walked out the door. In the elevator down to the lobby, Alara stood alone, backpack on her shoulder, eyes fixed on the floor, numbers dropping one by one. 2022. The year Phoebe died. Incident. Compensation Fund. It could have been a coincidence. There were hundreds of incidents in Nico Valente's world every year, but the way he had closed the laptop, the way he had looked at her after closing it, that wasn't the ordinary reflex of guarding private information. That was the reflex of a man who had just been seen in the place he kept hidden. Alara stepped out into the gray Boston afternoon. She didn't know what that document was. She didn't know whether it had anything to do with Phoebe or not. But for the first time in 4 years, a seed of suspicion had fallen into the ground she had believed was dead and dry, and it began to take root in silence. The room Alara rented in Dorchester was a third-floor studio in an old building on Adams Street, small enough for exactly one bed, one table, and one sink. But it had a lock on the door and a heater that worked, and after 7 months of sleeping in a car, it felt like heaven. Every morning before going to the penthouse, she stopped at the small coffee shop at the end of the block to buy a $2 cup of black coffee, then sat at the table by the window and reread her medical notes, trying to recover the things that 4 years away from school had begun to blur. That morning she pushed open the cafe door and saw a woman already sitting at the table she usually chose. 38 years old, brown hair neatly tied back, a beige leather jacket, no makeup, straight back, arms folded across her chest, an untouched cup of coffee in front of her. The woman looked at Alara as she walked in and gave a small nod, as if the meeting had been arranged in advance, even though the two of them had never spoken before. "Alara Finch," the woman said. It wasn't a question. Sit down. Coffee's on me. Ilara didn't sit. She stood beside the table, backpack on her shoulder, eyes sweeping the cafe in one quick motion, counting people, counting exits. An old habit. Who are you? Paige Holloway, Boston police detective. Homicide. Paige pulled a badge from her coat pocket and set it on the table long enough for Ilara to read it clearly, then slipped it away again. I'm not in any trouble with the police, Ilara said. I know. Your record is clean. No arrests, no charges, not even a parking ticket. Paige tilted her head slightly. What's interesting is that 4 years ago, you filed requests asking the police to reopen the investigation into your sister's death. 3 times. All 3 requests were denied. Ilara went still. Phoebe's name in the mouth of a stranger always had that effect, turning part of her to stone for a fraction of a second before she forced herself back under control. She pulled out the chair and sat down. You know about Phoebe. I investigated Phoebe's case. Paige opened a thin briefcase beside her chair and pulled out a file folder, placing it on the table between them. Phoebe Finch, 19 years old, shot at the Quick Clean Laundromat, corner of Dorchester Avenue and Adams Street. October 17th, 2022. Case classified as gang-related. Closed after 6 months for lack of evidence. Paige looked at Ilara. I was the one who closed that file, and I haven't slept peacefully since. Ilara looked at the folder. She didn't open it. She didn't need to open it because she remembered every detail, had read the police report until she knew it by heart during the first year after Phoebe died, read it until the ink blurred from her tears. Then why close it? She asked, her voice flat. Because every road I followed ended in a wall, Paige said. The ballistics didn't match any gun in the gang records. Witnesses disappeared. Security footage was erased. And every lead I chased died at the same wall. Paige paused. Valente. Ilara didn't move, but inside her chest, the seed of suspicion that had been planted in the elevator of Millennium Tower suddenly throbbed. I'm not saying Nico Valente shot your sister, Paige continued, her tone careful, choosing each word. I'm saying someone in his organization did, and the cover-up that followed has Valente fingerprints all over it. Witnesses were paid to stay quiet. Cameras were erased by someone with access to the area's security system. Ballistics disappeared from evidence storage. Paige leaned forward. I haven't let this go for 4 years, Ilara, and 4 weeks ago I saw you walking into Millennium Tower every afternoon. You're inside now. Inside the wall I've been smashing into for 4 years. Ilara understood at once. You want me to spy. I want you to open your eyes. You're standing right beside the answer to your sister's death and you don't even know it. I'm not a spy. Ilara's voice turned cold. I'm not. And you're not safe either. Paige looked straight at her. You know what that world is. You know what happens when they don't need you anymore. I'm not asking you to wear a wire or steal documents. I'm only asking you to think about what you've seen and ask yourself why a mafia boss would care this much about a homeless girl. Ilara stood up. The chair scraped against the floor with a harsh sound. Thanks for the coffee. I'm not drinking it. She walked toward the door. Paige didn't follow. She only called after her, loud enough to be heard. When you're ready, you know how to find me. Badge number 4731. Homicide. Anytime. Ilara walked along the Dorchester sidewalk, the March wind still cold, but no longer cutting quite as deep, and her mind spun so fast it made her feel unsteady. She didn't want to think. But her mind had been trained to diagnose, to line symptoms up until they formed a disease, and now the symptoms were arranging themselves whether she wanted them to or not. Nico had read her file and stopped at Phoebe's name. The safe with the ring marked with the letter T and the file he never let anyone see. The way he had said every choice has consequences when he spoke about Tommy, as if his brother's death had not been a pure accident. Compensation Fund, Incident 2022. And now a police detective was telling her that every lead in Phoebe's death had pointed back to Valente. Coincidence? Maybe. But Ilara had studied medicine long enough to know that when symptoms begin to line up, it isn't coincidence. It's a diagnosis taking shape. She didn't want to believe it yet. She wasn't ready to believe it, because if she did, it would mean that the man who left a sugar cube beside her coffee cup every afternoon, the man she was beginning to see through his scars and his silences, that man might be tied to the reason her sister had ended up on the ground. And Ilara didn't know which part of her would collapse first if that turned out to be true. The part that was beginning to trust Nico Valente, or the part that had never once stopped loving Phoebe Finch. That night, Alara left the penthouse later than usual, because she checked Nico's electrocardiogram results twice, her mind still spinning with the fragments left over from that morning with Paige Holloway, and she needed something familiar to hold on to. Medical data, numbers, heart rhythms, things that don't lie. She refused to let Frankie drive her home the way he usually did, saying she wanted to walk, that she needed air. Frankie looked at her with plain disapproval but didn't push, because Alara had made it clear from the first day that she wasn't Nico's property, and she came and went on her own terms. The route from the train station back to her room in Dorchester passed through an alley between two old buildings on Adams Street, a stretch she walked every night and had never had trouble on, because in Dorchester, the homeless and the poor had their own rules. Don't touch each other. Don't cause trouble. Everyone lives their own hard life. But tonight, two men were standing in the middle of the alley. Not homeless men. Leather shoes. Dark jackets. Broad shoulders. The kind of men Alara had seen often enough in the lobby of Millennium Tower to recognize at once men from the underworld. Not the kind at the bottom, but the kind in the middle. The kind who took orders and carried them out. She stopped walking. Street instinct screamed at her to turn around, but behind her was darkness too, and she didn't know who else might be there. The man on the left stepped forward. Angular face, scar across the bridge of his nose, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Stay away from the boss, sweetheart," he said, in a voice as mild as if he were reading from a menu. "This is a message. Next time it won't be a message." Alara stepped back once. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You know exactly what we're talking about." The second man moved fast from the right, reaching for the backpack on her shoulder. Alara reacted by grabbing the strap and yanking back, but he was 3 times stronger. The backpack burst open. He jammed his hand inside and tore through it, clothes and the small first aid kit spilling across the concrete. Then he pulled out the notebook, the old medical notebook with the worn imitation leather cover, filled with Phoebe's notes in the margins. The notebook Alara had held in her arms to sleep for 4 years, the last thing in the world that still carried the warmth of her sister. The man held it up, flipped through a few pages, and laughed. "Doctor books? You wash dishes and read doctor books?" Then he tore it. The sound of paper ripping cut through the alley like the crack of bone breaking. He ripped the cover page clean away from the spine, and Alara lost control. She lunged at him. Not out of bravery, but out of pure instinct. The instinct of an animal protecting the last thing that belonged to it. She grabbed for the notebook. The first man punched her. His fist hit her left cheek. Her cheekbone rang with the impact. Her head snapped to the side, and her vision blurred for 2 seconds. She fell onto the concrete, her knees striking hard, but her arms still clutched the torn notebook against her chest. She didn't let go. She wouldn't let go even if it killed her. The 2 men stood there looking at her on the ground, clutching that torn notebook. Split lip, blood running down her chin, eyes lifted toward them not with fear but with fury, the silent kind of fury that belongs to someone who has lost everything except one notebook. And 2 men had just laid hands on that one thing. "Next time it won't be a punch, sweetheart." Then they left, walked away normally, didn't run, didn't hurry, because in their world, beating a homeless girl in a dark alley wasn't the kind of thing that required haste. Alara sat there on the ground, back against the brick wall, lip split, cheek swelling, knees bleeding through her pants. She opened the notebook with trembling hands. The cover page was torn loose. 2 pages inside were ripped jaggedly across, but most of it was still there. Phoebe's notes were still there. "You're going to be the best doctor in the world" was still there. She held the notebook against her chest and cried, not because she was in pain, because this was the last thing Phoebe's hands had touched, the last thing still carrying the smell of her sister's hurried ink. And those 2 men had torn through it as if it were wrapping paper. She took out her phone. She didn't call the police because the police hadn't helped her once in 4 years. She called Walt. "Walt, I need you to come. Adams Street, the alley beside the liquor store." Walt didn't ask anything. 10 minutes. 15 minutes later, Alara was sitting on a stool in Walt's diner, while Walt knelt in front of her, wiping the blood from her lip with a warm cloth, old veteran's hands gentle in a way that still surprised her. He didn't ask who. He didn't ask why. He looked at the bruise, looked at the torn notebook, and understood enough. "Walk away, kid," he said, voice tired. "That world will swallow you whole. I can't. Not yet." "Why?" Alara said nothing. Because she couldn't tell him the real reason, that she needed the truth about Phoebe, that the pieces were lining up but still weren't enough, and that deep down, in the place she didn't dare look at too directly, she couldn't walk away from Nico, not because he paid her. Because of the sugar cube beside the coffee cup, because of the silence that didn't need filling, because he looked at her and saw her. 12 miles north, Nico's phone rang. Frankie, boss. The girl was attacked. Adams Street alley. 2 men. Threats. Silence on the other end. Then the crash of glass shattering. Frankie heard it clearly. A whiskey glass thrown into the wall. In 14 years of following Nico, Frankie could count on one hand the number of times the boss had lost control. This was the 4th. Who? Nico asked, voice not angry. Worse than angry. Quiet. The kind of quiet that comes before a storm. Gianni's men. I recognized one of the 2 from the diner camera last week. A long silence. Bring Gianni to my office. Now. 40 minutes later, Gianni Mancuso walked into the penthouse. Gray suit, slicked back hair, the confident smile of a man who believed he was smarter than everyone else in the room. Nico sat behind the desk, a fresh whiskey in front of him, full, untouched. The broken glass from the first one had already been cleared away, but the wet stain on the wall was still there. Gianni looked at it. His smile faded just a little. Boss calls me at midnight. Must be something important. Sit. Gianni sat. Nico didn't speak immediately. He took one sip of whiskey, set the glass down, then looked at Gianni with the same steel-gray eyes Alara had first seen in the dark alley, the eyes that had opened and gripped her wrist hard enough to bruise. The girl working for me was beaten by 2 men tonight. Gianni lifted his brows. The dishwasher girl? That's unfortunate. Dorchester has a lot of petty crime. Petty criminals don't wear Alan Edmonds' leather shoes and don't know to call me boss. Gianni. Silence. Gianni wasn't smiling anymore, but he still wasn't frightened. He was calculating. Nico could see it clearly, because Nico had watched people calculate for 14 years and knew exactly what it looked like when someone was weighing a lie against the truth. She's a problem, boss, Gianni said, choosing his words carefully. The families are talking. A Valente and a homeless girl? It makes us look weak. What makes us look weak, Nico said slowly, word by word, is when someone in my organization lays hands on a woman under my protection without my permission. He leaned forward. Touch her again, and I will personally remove each finger from the hand that's responsible. Is that clear? Gianni looked at Nico, searching for some sign that this was only talk. He found none. Clear, boss. Gianni stood, gave a nod, walked out with the stride of a man who still believed he was in control of the situation. But when the penthouse door shut behind him and he stepped into the elevator alone, he pulled out his phone, dialed, and when he spoke there was no trace of obedience left in his voice. He's gone. The homeless girl got into his head. Keep watching. Everything. After that night, everything changed. Alara arrived at the penthouse the following afternoon and saw a man she didn't know, standing in the ground floor lobby of Millennium Tower, dressed in a black suit, a wireless earpiece in one ear, his eyes sweeping over her from head to toe before he gave a small nod and let her into the elevator. On her way back to her room in Dorchester that night, she noticed a black sedan parked at the end of Adams Street, the driver sitting inside with his eyes fixed straight ahead at the building where she lived. The next morning, the sedan was still there. The afternoon after that, another man was standing at the coffee shop near her room, drinking one Americano for 2 full hours without taking his eyes off the window that looked out onto the street. Nico had placed protection around her without asking her permission. Alara walked into the penthouse on the 5th afternoon, didn't sit down, didn't open her backpack, just stood in the middle of the study and looked straight at Nico, who was sitting behind his desk. Pull your men back. Nico didn't look up from his laptop. No, I didn't ask you to protect me. You don't need to ask. This wasn't part of our agreement. Our agreement didn't include you getting beaten in a dark alley. For the first time, Nico's voice came out sharper than usual. He closed the laptop and looked at her. The bruise on Alara's cheek had shifted from purple to yellow-green. Her lip was still slightly swollen, and every time Nico looked at that bruise, his eyes darkened in a way Alara had already learned to recognize as dangerous, not for her, but for anyone who had put that bruise there. I'm not your property, she said. You're not my property. You're my responsibility. In your world, that's the same thing. Responsibility, property, possession, they all mean you control and I endure. Nico stood up. came out from behind the desk, stopped in front of her, closer than usual but not close enough to overwhelm her, close enough for her to see that his steel-gray eyes weren't as cold as she had thought, that there was something burning far behind them, something deep. "In my world," he said, his voice lower now, breaking faintly at the edges of each word. "That's the closest thing there is to love." The study went completely silent. The ticking of the wall clock suddenly sounded unbearably loud. That word, love, lay between them like a bullet that hadn't gone off yet. Nico didn't say anything more. Alara didn't answer. She opened her backpack, took out her stethoscope, and began the examination, as if the last 30 seconds had never happened. But when she placed the stethoscope against his chest, her hand wasn't steady, and the heartbeat she heard through it was faster than yesterday, and she didn't know whether it was his heart or her own. 2 days later, Nico called her at 10 o'clock at night. His voice was calm, but Alara already knew him well enough to hear what he was hiding beneath that calm. "Come to the penthouse. Bring sutures." She came. Frankie opened the door, his face grayer than usual. Nico was sitting in the leather chair in the study, black shirt on, his left shoulder darker than the rest of the fabric. Blood. A long cut across the shoulder, deep but clean. A knife wound, not a bullet. Negotiation went badly, Nico said shortly when she stepped in. "Not your concern. Your wound is my concern." She sat beside him, opened her medical bag, and cleaned the wound with betadine. Nico didn't flinch. He sat upright, jaw tight, eyes fixed straight ahead, and Alara remembered the scars on his back, remembered that this body had learned to endure pain from childhood so thoroughly that it no longer reacted. She began stitching. Needle through skin, thread pulled through, 7 stitches. Her hands, the hands that had stopped his bleeding in the dark alley, that had checked his pulse every afternoon, that had adjusted his medicine without a word, those hands were shaking now. Not much, but enough for Nico to notice. He lifted his right hand and wrapped it around her wrist, not the way he had gripped her that night in the alley, hard, rough, all instinct and survival. Gently, his fingers closed around the place where her pulse beat. "Steady," he said. One word. Alara looked at his hand on her wrist, then looked into his eyes. Close. Too close. She saw herself in those steel-gray eyes, reflected there, small and clear, and for the first time she understood why she couldn't walk away even though Walt had told her to, even though Paige had warned her, even though 2 men had beaten her in an alley, because no one looked at her the way he was looking at her now, as if she were the only thing in the room worth existing. "I'm steady," she said. They both knew it was a lie. She finished the last 3 stitches, wrapped the wound, gave Nico pain medication. 15 minutes later, he was asleep in the leather chair, the medicine dragging him under faster than usual because his body was already exhausted. Alara pulled a blanket over his shoulders and gathered her things. She turned to stand, and her elbow hit the edge of the desk. It was only a light bump, but enough to push a stack of papers to one side, and she saw the painting of Tuscany on the wall shift open just a crack. The safe, slightly open. Nico had opened it before she arrived, probably to take something out, and the pain medication had put him to sleep before he could lock it again. Alara looked at the safe, looked at Nico asleep. Her heart pounded in her ears. She shouldn't look. She knew she shouldn't look. But Compensation Fund, Incident 2022, was screaming in her head, and Paige Holloway had said every lead points to Valente and the ring engraved with the letter T that she had seen Nico clutch in his hand that first day. And 4 years without an answer for Phoebe's death were pressing down on her chest harder than any punch ever had. She opened the safe. Inside, the silver ring with the letter T, the black file folder, the handwritten letter. She opened the file. Crime scene photographs from the quick clean laundromat. White tile floor, blood, bullet holes in the window glass. And one photograph she would have known even with her eyes closed. Phoebe on the floor, eyes open, her laundromat uniform soaked red across the chest. Alara's hands shook so violently that she almost dropped the file. She turned another page. Internal ballistics report, names, dates, and the letter. Messy handwriting on lined paper, rushed writing, the writing of someone young, the same kind of handwriting Phoebe had used when she left notes in the margins of Alara's medical notebook, young and alive and now existing only on paper. "I'm sorry, brother. I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. The girl in the laundromat, I see her face every night. Signed, Tommy." Alara stared at the letter, stared at the name Tommy. stared at the photograph in the file. The young man of 20, black curly hair, bright eyes, the boy smiling beside the Vespa in Nico's wallet. His brother, Tommy Valente, had fired the bullet that killed Phoebe, and Nico knew. He had known from the beginning, known before he ever read her file, known when he asked about Phoebe and said every choice has consequences, known when he left the sugar cube beside her coffee and looked at her with the eyes she had mistaken for understanding when what she had really been seeing was guilt. Alara closed the safe. Gently, without a sound, she slipped the file and the letter into her backpack, walked through the room where Nico was asleep in the leather chair, the blanket she had draped over his shoulders, his face in sleep softer than when he was awake, younger, more like Tommy, and Alara had to bite down hard on her split lip until she tasted fresh blood to stop the cry rising in her throat. She stepped into the elevator, pressed the button for the ground floor. The doors slid shut, and Alara Finch went into freefall. She couldn't remember whether she had run or walked from Millennium Tower to Southie. She only remembered the cold, the wet sidewalks, and the sound of her own breathing breaking through the night in ragged bursts, as if her lungs were trying to pull in air that no longer held enough oxygen. It was 3 a.m. when she pushed open the back door of Walt's diner with hands that were still shaking. The door wasn't locked because Walt never locked the back door. He always said that anyone needing to come in at 3 a.m. was someone who needed help, not a thief. Walt was sitting behind the counter reading a book, The Sleepless Habit of an Old Veteran, and he looked up to see Alara standing in the middle of the diner, face white, eyes red, backpack on her shoulder. He set the book down and said nothing, just waited. Alara walked to the counter, opened her backpack, took out the black file folder and the handwritten letter on lined paper, and placed them on the wooden counter between them. Then she sat on her usual stool at the end of the counter and cried, not the kind of crying that comes with sobbing or screaming. Tears just ran silently down a motionless face, the kind of crying that belongs to someone so used to loss that the body processes pain without needing sound. Walt put on his glasses and opened the file. Read slowly. Crime scene photos from the laundromat, ballistics report, names, dates, then the letter. The girl in the laundromat, I see her face every night. Signed Tommy. He closed the file, took off his glasses, looked at Alara for a long time, and the eyes of the old veteran who had already seen enough death now carried a new kind of weariness. What are you going to do? Alara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. For 4 years I wanted to know who killed Phoebe. Now I know. Her voice broke. And I wish I didn't. Silence. Walt placed a glass of water in front of her. Not coffee. Water. Because sometimes people need the simplest thing. You know he'll come looking for you, Walt said. I know. You know that world doesn't let anyone walk away holding a file like that. I know. Then why did you take it? Alara looked at the black file folder on the counter. Inside it was the photograph of Phoebe, lying on the white tile floor. The photograph someone had taken and kept in a safe for 4 years. Because that was my sister. And I'm not leaving Phoebe inside the safe of the man who protected the one who killed her. At that same moment, 60 floors above Boston in Millennium Tower, Nico Valente woke in the leather chair. The pain medication had worn off. His left shoulder throbbed, and the first thing he saw was the blanket over his shoulders, the blanket Alara had placed there for him. And the second thing he saw was the painting of Tuscany on the wall standing slightly open, the safe exposed, empty. He didn't get up right away. He sat there looking at the empty safe. And the face of Nico Valente, the face that had stared down 3 rebellions, bullets, knives, and everything the underworld had hurled at him for 14 years without cracking, that face collapsed. Not from anger, not from fear of losing a secret. Frankie could handle secrets. Lawyers could handle evidence. But no one could handle the fact that Alara knew the truth now, and knew that he had hidden it from her all this time, had looked at her every day, listened to her speak about Phoebe, let her touch him, let her begin to trust him. While inside a safe, 3 steps away, there had been a photograph of her sister, lying dead on the floor because of his brother. He pulled out his phone, called. 1 ring, 2, 3, 4, 5. Voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. A 3rd time. A 4th time. Phone off. Nico called Frankie. She took Tommy's file. Find her. Silence on the other end. Then Frankie, his voice heavy. The voice of a man who had known this was coming from the moment he laid Alara Finch's file on the boss's desk. and saw Nico stop at Phoebe's name. Let her go, boss. This was always the only way it could end. Nothing ends until I say it ends. But Frankie had heard Nico's voice for 14 years. In interrogation rooms, in negotiations, in war, the boss's voice was always in order, sharp, cold, leaving no room for doubt. The voice tonight wasn't an order. It was a plea, and Frankie Conti, 52 years old, consigliere, a man who hadn't believed in love since his wife left him in '96, realized for the first time that his boss, the coldest mafia boss on the East Coast, was afraid. Not afraid of losing power, not afraid of prison, afraid of losing a homeless girl who washed dishes and whom he had known for less than a month. I'll look, Frankie said softly. But he didn't look, because that night Ilara left Walt's diner at 4 a.m, clutching her backpack and Phoebe's torn notebook, and walked 6 blocks to Pine Street Inn, the largest homeless shelter in New England, where she had once volunteered in exchange for breakfast, before Nico ever appeared in her life. She stood in line, took a bed, lay down in the shared room that smelled of sweat and bleach, between 20 other women who had nowhere else to go, and closed her eyes. She didn't sleep. She just lay there, holding Phoebe's notebook, and for the first time in 4 years, Ilara Finch wished she had kept walking down that alley the night it all began, instead of kneeling beside a bleeding stranger and spending her last $3 to save him. For 2 days, Ilara didn't leave Pine Street Inn. She lay on the lower bunk in the shared room, her face turned to the wall, Phoebe's notebook pressed to her chest, eating when meals were handed out, drinking water from the tap, and speaking to no one. The shelter staff didn't ask, because they had seen too many people lie facing the wall and knew that sometimes the best thing anyone can do is leave a person alone. At noon on the 3rd day, Ilara went downstairs to the dining hall to get lunch and saw Paige Holloway, sitting at a table near the door, the familiar beige leather jacket, a paper cup of coffee from outside, not the shelter's coffee. Paige looked up as Ilara walked in and showed no surprise, which meant she already knew Ilara was here, had been watching, had waited for the right moment. You found me faster than he did, Ilara said, sitting down across from her. Not because she wanted to talk, but because her legs were tired and the chairs here were free. He's looking for you with bodyguards and security cameras. I found you by understanding where a homeless person goes when there's nowhere else left. Paige set the coffee aside, pulled a folder from her bag, thinner than the file from before, but heavier because this wasn't information. It was an offer. Official deal. Signed by the Boston District Attorney's Office. You testify about what you know inside Valente's operation. Off the books, medical files, the private clinic with no license, any conversations you overheard. In return, Phoebe Finch's case is reopened with a full investigation, federal level, and no one will be able to close it again. Ilara looked at the folder, didn't open it. You already know about the file I took from Nico's safe. Paige neither confirmed nor denied it. I know you left Millennium Tower at 2 a.m. with a backpack heavier than when you arrived. I don't need to know what was inside. I need you sitting in front of a grand jury and saying what you know. Ilara opened the folder. Read. Legal language. Dry. Precise. But between those lines she saw Phoebe's name, saw reopened investigation, saw justice, and 4 years of thirst for answers started screaming in her chest. She wanted to sign. God, she wanted to sign. She wanted to watch someone stand in court and answer for the bullet that had taken her sister. She was angry. Angry enough that her hands shook. Angry at Nico because he had known. Angry because he had listened while she talked about Phoebe and said nothing. Angry because he had let her begin to trust him while his secret had been sitting 3 steps away in the safe. Angry because he had said, "That's the closest thing there is to love." And she had believed him. She took Phoebe's notebook out of her backpack, set it on the table beside the folder, flipped through the margin notes blurred from all the nights she had held it while sleeping. You're going to be the best doctor in the world. Remember to eat lunch. This chapter is so boring, sis. Phoebe's handwriting. Blue ink, slanting to the right because Phoebe had been left-handed, just like her sister. She turned the pages back and forth, as if she were asking Phoebe what to do. Then she stopped, not because she found an answer in the notebook, but because in her mind, in the middle of all that anger, other images pushed in uninvited. The bottle of metoprolol at the wrong dose on Nico's desk, the way she had corrected it without a word, and the next morning he had been taking the right dose without a word. The sponsorship file for St. Mary Orphanage, steady for 4 years, No sender's name. The sugar cube beside the espresso he never dropped in because his mother was dead, and habit was the only thing still alive. The scars on his back from childhood. The way he had said every choice has consequences, not with judgment in his voice, but pain. Because Tommy was his brother, and Tommy was dead, and Nico had carried that death and Phoebe's death in a safe against his chest for 4 years. He had hidden the truth, but he was dying from it too. His heart, his black heart in the most literal sense, thickening and moving toward the moment when it would stop if it wasn't treated. That heart had been carrying a blood debt so heavy that perhaps it was destroying itself. Nico didn't pull the trigger, Alara said, her voice rough. Paige looked at her, waited. He didn't shoot Phoebe. His brother did, and his brother is dead. But he buried the truth for 4 years, Paige said, her voice neither hard nor soft, the voice of someone who had done this work long enough to know how to persuade without pushing. He erased evidence, paid off witnesses, closed the case. For 4 years you had no answers because he decided you weren't allowed to have them. And destroying him will bring my sister back? Paige said nothing. Phoebe is still dead. My mother is still dead. 4 years are still gone. I put Nico Valente in prison, and what do I get? A sentence for the man who hid the truth about someone who's already dead? Alara closed Phoebe's notebook, pushed the folder back toward Paige. I'm not signing. Paige said nothing. Picked up the folder. Stood. At the door she turned back. You know my number. 4731. Then she left. Alara stayed sitting there alone in the shelter dining hall, surrounded by the smell of cooked noodles and the sound of an old television playing the news that no one was watching. She didn't sign the deal, but she didn't call Nico either. She was standing in the middle now, belonging to neither side, not an ally of the police, not one of Valente's people, just a woman of 27 holding her sister's torn notebook and not knowing where to place her next step. 4 miles away, in the office behind Serafina, Regina Ashworth's phone rang. Regina answered, and her eyes widened little by little. Alara had vanished from the penthouse, taken some kind of file. Nico was unraveling. Regina understood at once that this information had value. She called Gianni Mancuso 10 minutes later. The dishwasher girl took something from the boss's safe and ran. She's at Pine Street Inn. Gianni sat in a black sedan, listening, and his smile looked exactly like it had the night he watched those photographs of Nico at Walt's diner. Cold, calculating, with not a trace of warmth in it. She has the file. Nico is losing control because of her. This is our chance. He made the second call. Pine Street Inn. A woman. Alara Finch. Tonight. Clean. No trace. At 11 o'clock that night, Alara stepped out the back door of Pine Street Inn to breathe. The shared room was suffocating. The smell of bleach mixed with the smell of 20 women crammed together in a space with no real ventilation, and she needed cold air to keep her head clear, because her mind was still spinning with the image of Phoebe on the white tiled floor, Tommy's letter, and Nico's face in sleep, softer than it ever was when he was awake. She stood on the concrete steps behind the shelter and drew in a deep breath, and she didn't hear the footsteps behind her until a burlap sack came down over her head. Someone yanked both her arms behind her back. She fought, kicked, drove her elbow into a soft body and heard a grunt, but the second pair of hands was stronger, cinching her wrists tight with a plastic zip tie and lifting her off the ground as if she weighed nothing more than a bag. She screamed, but the sack swallowed the sound. They threw her into a trunk. The lid slammed shut. Total darkness. The car moved. She had no idea for how long. Maybe 20 minutes. Maybe 40. She counted her breaths to stay calm, because panic in a sealed trunk meant running out of oxygen faster. That was basic medical knowledge she had thought she had left behind. But that was now saving her second by second. When the trunk opened, she smelled salt water, engine oil, and rust. Charlestown Navy Yard. The abandoned shipyard everyone in Boston knew about, and no one dared go near after dark. They dragged her inside an old warehouse. Corrugated walls streaked with rust, cracked concrete floor, industrial lights hanging from beams overhead casting a dull yellow glow. They dropped her into a metal chair, cut away the sack, tied her wrists to the chair arms with rope. She blinked against the sudden light, her eyes sweeping fast. Street instinct, counting men. 4, counting exits. 2, 1 large rolling steel door and 1 side door to the left, counting weapons. 2 men had visible guns at their hips. The other 2 almost certainly had theirs hidden under their jackets. Then the main door opened and Gianni Mancuso walked in. Light gray suit, white shirt, expensive cologne tangled with the smell of rust in the warehouse, polished leather shoes clicking across the cracked concrete as though he were walking on a red carpet. Courteous, unhurried, more terrifying than any shouted threat. "Miss Finch," Gianni said, pulling a folding chair across from her, sitting down, adjusting the cuff of his suit jacket, crossing one leg over the other, as if he were in his own living room. "You've become Nico's blind spot, and in our business, blind spots get people killed." Alara looked straight at Gianni. Her cheek was swollen from being hit during the abduction. Her old split lip from the Adam Street alley still hadn't fully healed, and now carried a fresh tear. But her eyes didn't lower, didn't turn away, didn't show fear. She had lost Phoebe. Lost her mother. Lost her home. Lost her car. Lost her trust in the man she had started to love. She had nothing left to lose, and so she had nothing left to fear. "He'll come," she said. "Not a threat, a fact." Gianni smiled. "I'm counting on that." He took out his phone and signaled for one of his men to start recording. "Smile, Miss Finch. Say hello to the boss." The camera rolled. Alara sat in the metal chair, wrists bound, face bruised, dull yellow light spilling down over her from above, and she looked straight into the lens. She didn't smile, didn't cry, didn't beg. She only looked, with the same eyes Nico had first seen in that dark alley when she told him to shut up and lie still. Gianni recorded one more voice message. "Nico, the girl's here. The file is here too. She walks when you walk. Abdicate, transfer everything. Clean. You keep your life. She keeps hers. You have until morning. Sent." 12 minutes later, in the penthouse at Millennium Tower, Nico opened the video. He saw Alara on the screen, bruised face, hands tied. But her eyes looked straight into the camera without fear, and in that moment Nico didn't see a hostage. He saw the girl kneeling in the dark alley with her hand pressed to the wound on his head, saying, "No one told me to do it." He saw her hands trembling as she stitched his shoulder. He saw the sugar cube she never dropped into her coffee. He saw all of it, and all of it was now trapped inside a rusted warehouse because of him, because he had let her come close, because he had let her become the one thing in this world he couldn't bear to lose. Nico destroyed the study, not just smashing a glass the way he had before. This time he overturned the desk, swept everything from the shelves onto the floor, punched the bathroom mirror until the skin split across his knuckles and blood smeared the broken shards, and Frankie stood in the doorway waiting for the storm to pass, because he had survived enough of Nico's storms to know that stepping in right now was the fastest way to lose teeth. When Nico finally stopped, his right hand wrapped in a white towel already soaked red, his breathing heavy, his eyes colder than Frankie had ever seen them, he said, "Everyone's still loyal. All of them. Now." Frankie nodded. "Then what? Bring her home. Not find her, not save her. Bring her home." As if this penthouse, this empire, this life of his now had a new meaning for the word home. And home was wherever Alara Finch was. In the warehouse at Charlestown, Gianni left after recording the video, leaving behind 4 men on guard and strict instructions. Keep her intact until morning. No one touches her. 3 of the men went outside to smoke. The 4th sat on a folding chair across from Alara, gun resting across his thigh, eyes half closed. Alara watched him, not with the eyes of someone afraid, but with the eyes of a doctor. The guard looked around 30, broad-shouldered, but his breathing carried a faint wheeze, the kind of wheeze a second-year medical student learns in the first week of the allergy chapter. A red rash ran from beneath his ear down into his collar, and in the breast pocket of his jacket, sticking up just enough, was the yellow plastic tip of something Alara recognized immediately, an EpiPen, emergency epinephrine for anaphylactic shock. The man had a severe allergy, and it was being triggered. Maybe by the dust in the warehouse, maybe by the smell of rust, maybe by something he had eaten before arriving. His breathing grew heavier. He scratched at his neck. The rash spread wider. Alara looked around. On the concrete floor near his feet sat a takeout carton, roasted peanuts, the cheap kind sold in convenience stores. Peanuts. Peanut allergy was one of the most common causes of anaphylaxis in America. He had eaten peanuts while his body was already reacting. Alara looked at the peanut box, looked at the EpiPen in his pocket, looked at the rope around her wrists, which had loosened since earlier because she had been twisting her hands steadily for the past 2 hours, a trick she had learned from her time on the street. She took a breath, then kicked. Her foot hit the peanut box and sent it flying. Peanuts bursting everywhere, landing in his lap, across his hands. Peanut dust spraying up into his face. He sneezed, then coughed. Then his throat began to swell. His eyes went wide. His hand clawed at his jacket pocket for the EpiPen, but his fingers were already swollen and shaking too hard to get the cap off. He fell from the chair onto his knees, gasping, wheezing, face turning dark red. Alara yanked one wrist free from the rope, now loosened enough to give, the skin scraping raw. But she barely felt it, because adrenaline was racing through her body, and she lunged forward, snatching the EpiPen from his hand. The man looked at her with pure panic, the same look Alara had seen so many times in emergency rooms, the eyes of someone about to die and knowing it. "I'll give you this if you cut me loose," she said, her voice calm, a doctor's voice, the voice she had thought she had forgotten. The man nodded frantically. Alara pulled the folding knife from his belt, cut the rope from her legs, then uncapped the EpiPen, drove it into his outer thigh straight through the fabric, held it there for 10 seconds, then pulled it free. Epinephrine surged into his bloodstream. He could breathe again. His throat began to ease. His eyes fixed on her in confusion, because the woman he had been guarding as a hostage had just saved his life. Alara stood, looked down at him on the floor. She could have left. She should have left. But she turned back, checked his breathing, rolled him into the recovery position, made sure his airway stayed open. Because she was a doctor. Even if she had dropped out. Even if she washed dishes. Even if she had been homeless. Even if this man had been guarding her for the people who meant to hurt her. She was a doctor, and doctors don't leave patients dying on the floor. Then she ran. Through the side door on the left, out into the night, the salty, cold air of Boston Harbor slammed into her face. She ran across the concrete dock, barefoot because her shoes had slipped off while she was struggling, gravel slicing the soles of her feet, and then she saw headlights. Not one pair, 5 black SUVs tearing through the gates of Charlestown Navy Yard, braking hard, doors flying open, men spilling out with guns in hand, and at the front of it all, stepping from the lead SUV, no suit, black shirt, right hand wrapped in white bandage already soaked through with blood, steel gray eyes sweeping the warehouse, then the docks, then stopping on her. Nico Valente saw Alara Finch come out of the darkness, barefoot, wrists cut raw, face bruised, but still standing straight. She stood on the concrete pier, and he stood 10 steps away from her, the headlights from the line of SUVs blazing behind him and turning him into a dark shape edged with light, and for 1 second, no one moved. Then Nico stepped forward, 1 step at a time. He didn't run. He didn't hurry, as if he was afraid that moving any faster would make her disappear, because the things he wanted to keep were always the things that disappeared. He stopped in front of her, looked at the bruise on her cheek, the cut on her lip, the raw marks on her wrists where the rope had bitten until blood welled, her bare feet on the freezing concrete, and her eyes, those eyes that weren't afraid, those eyes that had stared straight into Gianni's camera without blinking, those eyes that were looking at him now with something more complicated than anger, more complicated than pain, more complicated than any word he knew. He lifted his right hand, the hand wrapped in white bandage stained with blood from the mirror he had smashed, lifted it slowly toward her face, then stopped, 2 inches from her cheek, not sure she would allow it, not sure she wanted him to touch her after everything she now knew, and in that moment Nico Valente, the man who never asked permission from anyone for anything, was asking permission from a barefoot girl on the docks. Alara looked at the hand suspended in front of her, the hand wrapped in bloody bandage, the hand that had signed death orders, had torn his study apart because of her, had gripped the ring engraved with the letter T through 4 years of guilt. She took his hand, drew it down, pressed it against her cheek. "I'm alive," she said. Nico closed his eyes. 1 second. When he opened them again, his eyes were wet. And that was something Alara had never seen, never imagined she would see in this man. "I know," he said, his voice breaking at the edges, no longer the boss's voice, no longer a voice of command, only the voice of a man who had just been given back the thing he thought he had already lost. Then came the sound of engines behind them, fresh headlights. 3 black sedans tore through the gates of the Navy Yard from the opposite direction. Gianni's team. Gianni Mancuso stepped out of the lead sedan, his pale gray suit still immaculate, 12 armed men spreading out on either side of him. He looked at Nico and Alara, standing together on the docks, looked at Nico's line of SUVs, calculated quickly. "You got here sooner than I expected," Gianni said, his voice calm. "The girl managed to get out then. Interesting. I underestimated the dishwasher." "Your last mistake," Nico said. "Everything happened in 60 seconds. Frankie gave the order." Nico's men moved. Gianni's men reacted, but half a beat too slowly, because half of them didn't want to die for a traitor, and the other half weren't loyal enough to fire on men from their own family. The fight was short and violent, 2 gunshots cracking across the dock, one slamming into the corrugated wall of the warehouse, one into a sedan, and no one died because Frankie had been doing this for 30 years and knew how to end things fast. Gianni's men dropped their weapons. Gianni stood alone in the middle of the dock, his suit still neat, but for the first time the smile was gone from his eyes. Nico walked toward him, gun in hand, stopped in front of him. The distance between the 2 men was close enough for Alara to see Nico's finger on the trigger and to know with perfect clarity that he was going to shoot. Not because Gianni had betrayed him, because Gianni had kidnapped her, because of the bruise on her face, because Nico Valente paid debts in violence, and this was the biggest debt of all. "Don't," Alara's voice, not shouted, not pleading, spoken evenly, in her doctor's voice, the same voice she had used when she told him to shut up and lie still in the dark alley, the voice that somehow always cut through everything and reached him. Nico didn't turn around, but he heard her. She knew he heard because his finger stopped on the trigger. "If you kill him, you become something I can't forgive. I've lost too many people to bullets. Phoebe died because of a bullet. Tommy died because of recklessness. Your mother died because of violence. Enough." Nico stood there, gun raised. Gianni watched him, waiting. The whole dock went silent except for the sound of waves striking the pier and engines rumbling low in the night. Then Nico lowered the gun, slowly, as if he were lowering a part of himself. He turned to Frankie. "Call Holloway." Frankie lifted his brows. In 30 years, it was the first time he had heard the boss say the name of a police detective without adding the word eliminate. "Detective Paige Holloway. Homicide. Badge 4731. Call now." Frankie understood. He called. 20 minutes later, Paige Holloway arrived at Charlestown Navy Yard in 3 police cars with no lights and no sirens. She took in the scene. Gianni Mancuso bound and kneeling on the dock, 12 of Gianni's men lying face down with their hands behind their heads, Nico Valente standing beside an SUV with his hand still wrapped in bandage, and Alara Finch sitting on the steps of the warehouse with a pair of shoes someone had found for her and a blanket around her shoulders. Nico walked over to Paige. "Gianni Mancuso. Kidnapping. Extortion. Internal rebellion. Evidence of his illegal operations over the last 4 years will be on your desk tomorrow morning." Paige looked at Nico, looked at Alara, looked back at Nico. "You're handing your underboss to the police. I'm cleaning house." Paige understood. This wasn't only about removing an enemy. This was the first step in a transformation. Nico Valente was handing the law something he once would have dealt with himself, and that was a door that, once opened, couldn't be shut again. Regina Ashworth had already been stripped of her position at Serafina and banished from the city's business circles, a quiet but absolute removal that ensured she would never hold power over another soul again. She nodded. The police took Gianni away. The black sedans were impounded. The dock slowly emptied. Nico looked at Alara. Alara looked at Nico. She stood up, the blanket slipping from her shoulders, and walked toward him. "Penthouse," she said. "You and me. Now." It wasn't a romantic request. It was an ultimatum. 40 minutes later, they were sitting across from each other in the study of the Millennium Tower penthouse. The room was still wrecked from the storm Nico had unleashed. Broken mirror, books on the floor, shelves overturned. In the middle of the wreckage, Alara set the black file folder on the desk. Beside it, the lined paper letter in that messy handwriting. She looked straight at Nico, her eyes dry because she had already cried enough. "I know, Nico. I know Tommy killed Phoebe." Silence filled the ruined penthouse for so long that Alara could hear her own heart beating in her ears. Then Nico spoke. Not in the boss's voice. Not in the voice he used for negotiation. In the voice of a man who had carried a slab of stone inside his chest for 4 years and was finally setting it down, even knowing that setting it down might cost him everything. "Tommy was 20, he began. his eyes fixed on the black file folder lying on the desk between them. Not on her. Not yet on her. He wanted to prove he was worthy of the Valente name. I kept him away from everything, sent him to school, sent him across Europe. But he always came back, always wanted in, always wanted to prove he wasn't just Nico Valente's weak little brother. He stopped, breathed. In October of 2022, I was in New York handling a real estate deal. Tommy was in Boston. He gave an order on his own to take out a low-level drug dealer in Dorchester who was causing trouble on our territory. He didn't ask me, didn't ask Frankie. He acted on his own. 2 boys he hired set up the ambush at the corner of Dorchester Avenue and Adams Street. Alara went rigid. She knew that corner. She would know that corner until the day she died. The target got away, Nico continued, his voice so flat it was almost mechanical, as if this was the only way he could tell it without breaking. The bullet went wide, through the glass door of the Quick Clean laundromat, hit a 19-year-old girl folding clothes behind the counter. He swallowed. Phoebe, her sister's name in his mouth. Alara heard it and felt as if she'd been stabbed. Not because of surprise, she already knew. She had read the file, but because hearing him say Phoebe's name in that voice, the voice of someone who knew exactly what had happened and had carried it for 4 years, was a different kind of pain. I found out 2 hours later. Frankie called me. I took the first flight back to Boston. When I got here, Tommy was sitting in this penthouse, in the chair you're sitting in now, shaking. Nico looked at the chair Alara was sitting in for the first time since he had begun telling her. He was 20 years old and he had just killed a 19-year-old girl whose name he didn't even know. He said, "I'm sorry, brother. I didn't mean it. I didn't know anyone was inside the laundromat." As if that changed anything. Nico stood up, walked to the window, looked out over Boston, the city he controlled, the city where 4 years ago his brother's bullet had taken her sister from her. I got Tommy to Italy that same night. Fake passport. Private flight. Before dawn, he was out of the United States. I stayed behind and cleaned up. Witnesses were paid to keep quiet. Security footage was erased. The ballistics vanished from evidence storage. The case was classified as gang-related, closed in 6 months. He turned and looked at her. 2 months later, Tommy died. Motorcycle crash outside Florence. Mountain road. High speed. The same recklessness that killed Phoebe. The longest silence of the night settled between them. Then Nico spoke again, each word deliberate, with no apology, no excuse, no attempt to soften anything. "I covered it up. I can't undo it, and I won't insult you by pretending that anything could ever make this right." He walked back to the desk, slipped a hand inside his breast pocket, and took out the silver ring engraved with the letter T, the ring he had carried against his heart since the beginning of all of this, and placed it beside the file. Then he opened the folder, took out Tommy's letter, the same letter Alara had already read inside the safe, and set it beside the ring. "This is all of it. All the truth." He looked at her. "Do whatever you want. Give it to the police. Destroy me. Walk away forever. I won't stop you." Alara looked at the silver ring. Small, plain, the letter T engraved inside the band. The ring of a 20-year-old boy who had died from the same recklessness that had killed her sister. She picked up the letter. Read it again, this time more slowly, word by word. The messy handwriting on lined paper. The writing of a child trapped inside the body of a grown man, terrified. "I'm sorry, brother. I never meant for anyone to get hurt. The girl in the laundromat, I see her face every night. I can't sleep. I don't know what to do. I'm sorry." Alara finished reading, set the letter down, and cried. But this wasn't the silent kind of crying, with tears sliding down a frozen face the way they had at Walt's Diner. It wasn't the kind where she turned toward the wall and let the grief hollow her out at Pine Street Inn. This was different. This was the kind of crying that shook her shoulders, caught in her breath, spilled out freely without any effort to control it. The kind of crying that belongs to someone who has finally been allowed to set down the weight she has carried for 4 years. 4 years of not knowing who. 4 years of not knowing why. 4 years of staring at ceilings, at the floor of a car, at the wall of a rented room, asking herself which bullet, from which gun, fired by whom, and why Phoebe, why her little sister, why that laundromat, why that moment, why that single bullet. Now she knew, and knowing didn't make it hurt less, but knowing gave it shape, knowing gave it borders. Not knowing had been an endless abyss, falling through one more level every day. Knowing was ground, hard, brutal, painful ground, but at least she could stand on it. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, stood up, took Phoebe's notebook from her backpack, and slipped it into the inside pocket of her coat, left the black file folder and Tommy's letter on the desk. But the silver ring, she looked at it for a long moment, then gently pushed it back toward Nico. "Keep it. He was your brother." She walked toward the door. Nico didn't stand, didn't follow, didn't call her name. He sat there, the silver ring in his hand, and watched her walk away. At the door, Alara stopped. She didn't turn around. "I need time. Take all the time you need." Nico's voice was rough, broken, but he didn't try to hold her there. For the first time in his life, Nico Valente let someone important walk out through a door without controlling it, without following, without sending anyone after her, without doing anything except sitting alone in the wrecked penthouse, holding the ring of his dead brother, and waiting without knowing what he was waiting for, waiting because it was the only thing she had left him. 3 months. For 3 months, Alara didn't call, didn't text, didn't appear, and Nico didn't look for her. He had promised, "As long as you need," and it was the first time in his life he kept a promise without knowing whether it would kill him or save him. In the first days, he sat in the ruined penthouse staring at the small silver ring engraved with the letter T and wondering where she was. Then he stopped wondering, and he started doing. In the second week, he called a lawyer, not the family lawyer, but an outside lawyer, a man who didn't know the difference between Valente Holdings and the Valente family. Nico signed the papers to establish a charity called Phoebe's Light, dedicated to supporting the families of gun violence victims, especially those shattered by stray bullets, those deaths without names in newspaper headlines, those Phoebe Finches the world forgets, even when their families never can. There was no press conference, no public relations campaign, not one line on the Valente Holdings website, only money transferred into the foundation account every month, steadily, and Phoebe Finch's name on the founding papers that only Nico, Frankie, and the lawyer ever saw. In the 4th week, he began the process Frankie called slow suicide, turning Valente Holdings into something fully legitimate. He pulled out of 2 gun pipelines in Dorchester, cut ties with 3 smaller families dependent on the weapons network. Every decision was a small war, and every small war could turn into a larger one. And Frankie told him, "You'll die before you finish." And Nico said, "Maybe, but the direction can't be reversed now." He wasn't doing it for Alara. He was doing it because of the silver ring in his breast pocket, because of the letter in that uneven handwriting, because of the 19-year-old girl folding clothes in the laundromat whom his brother had killed, because he had carried that debt for 4 years, and this was the only way he knew how to repay it. Not with money, not with power, but by dismantling the very machine that had produced the bullet. Alara was in New York. She enrolled in an accelerated medical program at Columbia for students returning after interruption, using the money she had saved from the months she worked for Nico, and every morning she woke in a small studio in Washington Heights, opened Phoebe's notebook, now carefully repaired, read 1 line of handwriting in the margin, and went to class. Every Saturday night, she treated homeless patients for free at a volunteer clinic in the Bowery, because she knew what it felt like to sit in an emergency room waiting chair at midnight in the winter and know that no one in the world cared whether you lived or died. One evening, Walt called. "There's a foundation called Phoebe's Light, kid." He created it. No one knows except me because I happened to see the papers when Frankie came by the diner. Alara sat on her bed with the phone pressed to her ear and said nothing for a long time. "He used Phoebe's name?" "He did." More silence. Then Alara said, "Thank you, Walt," and hung up, lay back, and stared at the New York ceiling. And for the first time in 3 months she thought of Nico not with anger or pain, but with something she still didn't dare name. 2 weeks later, Paige Holloway appeared in New York. She met Alara at a coffee shop near the school. No deal, no file, only a conversation. Gun violence in Southie is down 40% since Valente pulled out of the weapons trade. 3 new community centers opened. Anonymous funding. Paige paused. "I spent 10 years trying to bring him down. And a homeless girl with $3 changed him more than any badge ever did." Paige opened her bag and took out Phoebe Finch's case file. A red stamp across the front read, "Officially closed. This time it has an answer." Alara took the file, looked at the stamp. 4 years. Finally, 1 month later, Autumn. Alara stood in front of Walt's diner at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, backpack on her shoulder, Boston sunlight in October laying a warm gold across her face, and her face had changed. Not because she was less thin or less tired, but because her eyes no longer looked for an escape route every time she entered a room. She pushed open the door. Walt stood behind the counter drying a glass, looked up, saw her, and the smile on that old veteran's face looked for the first time in 60 years like the smile of a child. Kid. Walt. He leaned across the counter and hugged her. Then she looked out the window and saw the black Ducati Diavel parked across the street. Nico sat on the bike, black leather jacket, eyes fixed on the diner. He didn't come inside. He only watched. She turned to Walt. How long has he been there? Walt kept drying the glass and didn't look up. Every day. 3 months, 4 o'clock, same spot. Looking at this same window, never comes in, never asks, just sits. 3 months? 3 months. Alara looked through the glass. Nico looked back. A single street between them, 2 lanes of traffic, and 4 years of secrets. She stepped out of Walt's diner, crossed the sidewalk, crossed the road, stopped in front of the Ducati. Nico looked at her, said nothing, waited. Because he had already waited 3 months, and he could wait longer if she needed him to. Alara pulled Phoebe's notebook from her backpack, opened to the last page, handed it to him. Nico took the notebook, read the line of blue handwriting slanting slightly to the right. Today there was a regular customer at the laundromat, an Italian boy, really sweet smile. He forgot his handkerchief. I'll give it back tomorrow. Nico's hand trembled around the notebook. The Italian boy. Tommy. Phoebe had written about Tommy. She had seen Tommy before the day she died. She had thought he looked kind. She had meant to return his handkerchief to him on a tomorrow that never came. She thought he was kind. Alara said softly. Nico closed the notebook, gave it back to her. His eyes were wet for the second time she had ever seen, and she knew there wouldn't be a third, because Nico Valente wasn't a man who cried, but Tommy's name in Phoebe's handwriting, the gentleness of 2 young lives before a bullet destroyed them both, that was enough to break any wall. 1 year later, the following autumn, Dorchester. The old building on the corner of Dorchester Avenue and Adams Street, 2 blocks from the Quick Clean laundromat, had been renovated into a community clinic. A new sign, white letters on a blue background. Phoebe Finch Community Clinic. Alara stood at the entrance in a white coat, a stethoscope around her neck, Phoebe's notebook in her pocket. Not yet a full doctor, 1 year left until graduation, but already the director of the free community care program, combining victim support and first aid training for neighborhood residents. Beside her stood Nico. No suit, white shirt, his hand no longer wrapped in bandage, the silver ring with the letter T on the little finger of his right hand, no longer hidden. Walt sat in the front row beside Frankie, 2 old men nodding to each other with the kind of nod shared by people who have lived long enough to know the world is stranger than anyone imagines. Paige stood in the back with her arms crossed, giving Alara a small nod when their eyes met. In the clinic courtyard, on the brick path leading to the front door, there was one engraved brick marked with 2 initials, T.V. No one but Nico and Alara knew what they meant. Tommy Valente. The Italian boy Phoebe thought was kind. The younger brother Nico could not save. 2 small letters on 1 brick among hundreds, invisible to the world but eternal to the 2 people who stepped over it every day. Nico stood beside Alara, watching the line of people waiting for treatment. Old men, young mothers carrying children, boys from Dorchester receiving free medical care for the first time in their lives, and he murmured low enough for only her to hear. You saved my life with $3. You rebuilt my soul without taking a cent. Alara looked at him, the man she found bleeding in a dark alley, the man whose secret had nearly destroyed her, the man who left a sugar cube beside his coffee cup and never dropped it in, the man who tore apart a piece of his own empire to pay a debt no one had asked him to pay. You gave me back the one thing I thought I had lost, she said, a reason to keep saving people. She began with $3 and a prayer. She ended with a legacy. And between those 2 points there was 1 winter night in Boston, 1 dark alley, 1 bullet from 4 years earlier, 2 notebooks, 1 silver ring, and 2 broken people who found a way to stand again, not by forgetting, but by turning pain into something meaningful for other people. Sometimes in life, the smallest act carries the greatest power. $3 can't buy back a life, but $3 spent at the right moment, in the right place, by the right person, can change two lives forever. This story reminds us that kindness isn't weakness, forgiveness isn't forgetting, and sometimes the person most worthy of being saved is the one the world tells us to walk away from. If this story touched your heart, please press the like button, share this video with the people you love, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the moving stories we share every day. How did this story make you feel? In real life, have you ever stood in that place between walking away and staying to help someone? We'd love to hear what's in your heart, so please leave a comment below and let's share and connect together. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, peace, and quiet happiness every day. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.